We've always been fascinated by pyramids and what lies inside. But did you know that in northern Sudan, just outside the modern village of Karima, lies an ancient burial site that holds more mysteries than the pyramids of Giza? Called Nuri, the archaeological site was once the royal cemetery of the Kingdom of Kush, a powerful Nubian civilization that ruled parts of what is now Sudan and Egypt. Among the pyramids at Nuri is the tomb of King Nastasen, who ruled in the 4th century BCE and was the last Kushite king known to be buried at this site. It remained largely untouched for centuries, but in recent years, a team of archaeologists took the risk of diving into its flooded depths in search of the past. What they found was more fragile, more revealing, and more haunting than anyone expected. Why had the tomb remained sealed for over 2,000 years? What clues did it hold about a nearly forgotten African dynasty? And just how close had we come to losing it forever? Let's get into it. The Nuri Pyramids. Year after year, the pyramids in Egypt draw hundreds of thousands of tourists, and even looters. And it's not hard to see why. Beyond their massive, mysterious structures, the legends of gold and hidden riches made them prime targets. For centuries, tomb raiding became so common that finding an untouched pyramid was almost impossible. It's part of what made King Tut so popular. Because in the grand scheme of things, he wasn't exactly the most powerful while he was alive. But in death, his tomb was one of the rare few to survive mostly intact, and when it was uncovered, it caused a sensation. Suddenly, the world was paying attention, not to his reign, but to what had been preserved. However, what if we told you that in 2019, researchers and archaeologists discovered the tomb of a king with much more significance? That's right. Just outside the town of Karima in northern Sudan stands Nuri, a quiet desert landscape where pyramids rise out of the earth like broken teeth. Although the site has become a shadow of itself due to time and nature, it was once a royal cemetery for the kings and queens of the Kingdom of Kush, an ancient African empire that thrived along the Nile Valley. Over 50 pyramids are still visible today, with many more buried beneath sand, time, and rising water. Nuri is located on the eastern side of the Nile, just across from Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain believed to hold religious significance to both the Kushites and ancient Egyptians. If you've never heard of the Kushites before, that's largely because the ancient Kushite royal line and political system collapsed in the 4th century CE. In ancient times, they ruled from their capital in Napata, and between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, they built royal pyramids here to house their dead. Sounds familiar? Well, that's because many of their burial practices were influenced by ancient Egypt. Although Kush developed their own culture, when Egypt conquered Kush, they brought their religion, gods, and architecture with them. Temples were built, Egyptian officials were installed, and Nubian elites were educated in Egyptian customs. Over time, the Kushites didn't just adopt these influences, they internalized them. And later, when the Kushite kingdom grew strong enough to turn the tables and rule Egypt during the 25th dynasty, they carried those same Egyptian traditions back south. The pyramids at Nuri are a direct reflection of that legacy. Although smaller and steeper than those at Giza, they were inspired by the same ideas: death as a transition, the importance of divine kingship, and a belief in the afterlife. The Kushites embraced these values so deeply that even after they lost control of Egypt, they continued building pyramids long after the Egyptians had stopped. In a way, you could say that they held on to those traditions more tightly than the people who first introduced them. So, what changed? Why are their pyramids half buried under the Nile? Race against the Nile. The simple answer is, the geography. It's ironic, but over the centuries, the environmental conditions that once made this region prosperous has become a growing threat. Year after year, the Nile's groundwater levels began to rise, and Nuri's low-lying burial chambers, they began to flood. It seems sudden, but it wasn't. It happened slowly, as centuries of environmental change, seasonal floods, irrigation, and modern dam construction pushed the water table higher. As a result, much of Nuri's underground architecture, the heart of the tombs where kings were laid to rest, became completely submerged. But this didn't stop earlier archaeologists from trying to explore them, including George Reisner in the early 20th century. Unfortunately, it wasn't an easy task, and because they were faced with rising water and unstable tunnels, most left them untouched. By the early 2000s, many believed these tombs were simply inaccessible. And their contents? Safe to assume they were either lost or too water damaged to recover. But that changed in 2018, when archaeologist Dr. Piers Paul Kriesman, a specialist in ancient environments and underwater archaeology, began preparations for a high-risk dive into one of Nuri's most waterlogged pyramids, the tomb of King Nastasen. Granted, he isn't quite as popular as King Tut and his pyramid, but he is believed to have been much more powerful. Nastasen ruled in the 4th century BCE and was the last known Kushite king buried at Nuri. Although he isn't widely known today, it doesn't diminish his power. In fact, many scholars consider him far more significant than some of the pharaohs who dominate popular imagination. Nastasen ruled Kush during a critical turning point, and his reign wasn't passive. He left behind an inscription known as the Nastasen Stela, which describes him defending Kush from invaders to the north. Though historians debate who exactly he fought, the message is clear: Nastasen was a king who actively protected his kingdom. His pyramid at Nuri is also telling. Built generations after the Kushites lost control of Egypt, its size and construction were a statement of continued authority, wealth, and spiritual legitimacy. It wasn't simply a tomb, it seemed more like a monument declaring that Kushite kingship still mattered. And that's what makes the dive into his burial chamber so compelling. While Tut's tomb dazzled the world with gold, Nastasen's offers something quieter but just as valuable: a window into a royal legacy that didn't fade quietly but adapted, persisted, and continued to shape African identity long after it was left out of the mainstream story. Although his pyramid sits at a lower elevation than many others, making it one of the most deeply submerged, Dr. Pierce and his team decided to explore. And royal regalia that blended Egyptian symbolism with distinctly Nubian interpretations. For researchers, every piece of pigment is a clue. But not all tombs were so fortunate. Over the centuries, many were looted, battered by floods, or weakened by time. Some collapsed entirely. Others remain half submerged, their entrances blocked by sand or hidden beneath layers of silt. And yet, Nastasen's tomb survived, intact, sealed, and protected by water. If one burial chamber stayed untouched for 2,000 years, what else might be waiting? That's what makes the Nuri site so electrifying. It's not just a historic cemetery, it's kind of like an archaeological frontier. Every tomb is a question mark. And every wall of stone could be hiding untold stories about African kingship, queenship, faith, warfare, and culture. Now that we've got a bit of perspective on Kush and its kings, let's take a turn back to Pierce and his team in 2019. What was it they found in the tomb? And why did it shock the world? A tomb sealed but dangerously fragile. What would you expect in a tomb that's been submerged under water for decades? Dr. Pierce and his team certainly weren't expecting what they found. When they finally entered the third chamber of King Nastasen's tomb, their excitement was matched by a sudden stillness. The space was completely filled with dark, murky water, but in its depths lay something surprising: a sealed sarcophagus, along with fragments of gold leaf and a gold-covered toe cap resting on a human bone. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But when you've dived into dangerous waters to chart forgotten history, these things aren't just curious objects, they're part of an ancient, lost civilization. In fact, this was a major archaeological find, rare partly because most ancient royal tombs in Egypt and Nubia were looted millennia ago. Guards, thieves, early explorers, even local people, had entered many such chambers, often leaving nothing behind. This is why the first thought on the team's minds was that they were right: this tomb had been untouched for centuries. They had made a good call to foray into the deep because this discovery of undisturbed artifacts was not only extraordinary, it was valuable for understanding Kushite burial practices. These tombs suggest, and the presence of gold leaf suggests, that parts of the burial platform or coffin were once richly decorated, even if these original materials had long decayed. The gold toe cap, tiny but telling, hints at the full regalia once worn by the king's body. Together, these artifacts provide rare insight into how Kushite royalty were prepared for the afterlife. But even though the tomb's intact state was a major win, it also brought new challenges. The objects were in precarious condition, long submerged in water, and vulnerable to rapid deterioration the moment they were disturbed. The submerged sarcophagus, likely stone, still sat in place, but the surrounding walls were soaked, and parts of the ceiling showed signs of strain. In the second chamber above, sections had already collapsed, raising concern that more rock could shift at any moment. Even the steel chute they'd used to enter was a temporary brace, not a permanent structure, and deeper inside, no support existed. Water damage had already taken its toll. Metal corrodes when wet, especially in water rich in minerals. Over time, wood decays, plaster dissolves, and even paint flakes off stone under these conditions. What remained in the tomb was delicate, and every inch of progress posed a risk. To document and conserve the contents, divers had to move methodically. They didn't start by opening or removing the sarcophagus. Instead, they spent hours carefully clearing silt, brushing stonework, and creating photographic records, all by hand and underwater. Every sediment-filled bucket had to be removed through the chute before more could be brought up. Air supply was another major constraint. Divers used surface-supplied hoses, strings of tubing providing oxygen from the surface, because there wasn't enough room for scuba tanks. Those hoses defined every dive, tangle them, pierce them, and a diver could be trapped or suffocated. Any pause worked against them. The longer a diver remained in a coffin chamber, the greater the risk to both their safety and the integrity of the tomb's contents. Documentation versus extraction. It was insanely challenging work because for many reasons, removing artifacts underwater is intensely difficult. Divers can't grip, wet materials are slippery or fragile, and as soon as something leaves the water, it begins to dry, crack, or flake. To avoid shock damage, conservators planned to transfer items into a controlled environment, humid chambers, desalination baths, and gradual drying areas, to stabilize them before further study. In one early dive, technicians discovered a void around the sarcophagus lid, suggesting the tomb had been filled with sand or jumbled collapse before the final sealing. If so, removing the lid could collapse the entire structure. What were they to do? Initial emphasis was on mapping and photographing every surface of the tomb, from chamber walls to the base of the sarcophagus. They labeled sediment layers, noted collapsing areas, and charted movement points, because over the next months or years, the structure could shift dramatically. Surface conservators meanwhile prepared drying protocols. Small samples, like flakes of gold leaf and bone fragments, were carefully retrieved in vials, sealed in bottles filled with conservation-grade liquid, and labeled for immediate analysis. The big question was, should they attempt to remove the sarcophagus and bones? While removing it intact could save priceless data, it also risked collapse. Leaving it in place, on the other hand, meant continued deterioration. There was no easy choice. Ultimately, the team decided that it was best to leave the discoveries for another day. If ever there was a way to extract them without risking collapse or deterioration, they would be back to do justice to it. After all, leaving it there without proper extraction methods would only lead to its destruction. As they exited the third chamber, Pierce described the moment in a bittersweet manner, saying that they opened the tomb, but found themselves racing time, water, and decay itself.